Before we begin, I need you to do something simple. Go to the nearest window from where you are right now. Look outside. If it's daytime, notice the light falling on the walls, the trees, the cars, the people. If it's nighttime, notice the darkness and the small lights on in the neighboring houses. Look for a few seconds and answer me within yourself a simple question. What day of the week is today? If the answer is Sunday, I need to tell you something you probably have never heard in your life. The reason today for you is a day different from the others, a day when perhaps the stores close earlier, when masses and services are fuller, when many people rest, when time seems to pass with a different weight. That reason does not come from the Gospels, it does not come from the Apostles, it does not come from Galilee. It comes from a decree signed by a Roman emperor on March 7th of the year 321 after Christ. And this decree, written in Latin by imperial hands on official parchment, does not use the word Christ. It does not use the word Lord. It does not use the word resurrection. It uses in full a precise expression, die solis, day of the sun. The day you rest today is, at the origin of the decree that instituted it, the day consecrated to the sun god. I know it sounds absurd, it sounds like something from someone trying to sell conspiracy theories on the internet, but the decree is there. You can look it up. It is in the archives. It is in serious manuals of Roman history. It is in universities. The emperor who signed this decree, and who forever changed the Western calendar, was the same man who, according to tradition, is considered the great convert of Christianity, the man who supposedly saw a cross in the sky before a battle, the man who is still, today, in some churches, venerated as a saint. His name is Constantine. And this is just the first of many, many strange things you will never hear in a Sunday sermon, but which are written in stone, in metal, in parchment, waiting for someone brave enough to look. Today, finally, you will look, but not with me. I am just the voice that guides. The one who will take you on this journey is another man, a man who at first glance has nothing to do with Rome, with Constantine, with the history of Christianity. He was Jewish. He was Dutch. He lived by the silent profession of polishing microscope lenses, 1 millimeter a day, in a narrow room near a canal in Amsterdam. But within that seemingly ordinary man resided a mind that, centuries after his death, would make Einstein say in a famous telegram, "I believe in the God of Spinoza." Yes, Spinoza. The story of this man is in itself a novel. At 24, he was expelled from his own community. It was not a symbolic expulsion. It was a public, ritual, terrible expulsion. The entire synagogue of Amsterdam gathered one afternoon in July of 1656. They lit black candles one by one. They blew a ram's horn, long and loud. And, in the center, an officiant read aloud a curse in ancient Hebrew, a curse that asked for him to be cursed by day and cursed by night, when lying down and when rising, when going out and when coming in, that no one should speak to him, that no one should read his books, that no one should come within 4 cubits of his body, that his name should be literally erased. His name, in Hebrew, was Baruch, which means, in full, blessed. Think for a second about the weight of this scene. The Blessed One being publicly cursed in the light of black candles by his own brothers in the very house of prayer. He walked out the door of the synagogue that day, crossed the square in silence, gathered his things and never returned. He changed his name to Bento, the Latin translation of blessed, and, from that moment, he began a new life, the life of a lens polisher. The life of a philosopher, the life of a man who decided to think to the end, no matter who it hurt, no matter the cost. I tell you this before anything else, because you need to understand where I speak from. You need to understand that what I am going to tell you is not the angry outburst of an enemy of faith. It is not the cheap pamphleteering of a militant atheist. It is not the bored sarcasm of someone who has never believed in anything and therefore despises everything. I believed. I believed deeply. I was raised within one of the most serious religious traditions in the world. I read the scriptures morning, noon, and night. I knew entire psalms by heart. I knew what it was to fast, what it was to keep the Sabbath. what it was to feel the sacred silence descend upon a house when the candles were lit on Friday night. When I began to ask questions, honest questions, childlike questions, questions anyone would ask if they stopped to think. I did not ask to destroy. I asked to understand. And the more I read, the more I realized that there were, within the sacred texts, contradictions. Not small contradictions, not details, but large, deep, structural ones. I saw that Moses, who supposedly wrote the first 5 books of the Torah, described in the 5th book his own death and burial. How? I saw that there were 2 different accounts of creation. I saw that there were 2 different versions of the flood stitched together. I saw that there were entire passages that seemed to have been written by different hands, at different times, with different agendas. I did not invent these observations. I just had the courage to write them down, and for that I was cursed. But I tell you this because when you hear what I am going to tell you about Constantine, about the Council of Nicaea, about the bishops of the Roman Empire, about what happened to Christianity between the year 300 and the year 400, I want you to understand that I am using about Christianity exactly the same type of gaze that I used about Judaism. The same honesty, the same rigor, the same desire to understand and not to destroy. I am not sparing one religion and attacking another. I am using reason, that cold, patient, relentless faculty, to look at both. And what I see, looking this way, is that all institutional religion sooner or later makes the same move. All institutional religion, sooner or later, ceases to be an experience and becomes a structure, ceases to be a path and becomes a throne, ceases to be an inner calling and becomes an instrument of power. And that is exactly what happened to Christianity. Not at the beginning. In the beginning it was something else. In the beginning it was an underground, dangerous, living current. In the beginning there were small groups meeting in merchants' homes, in basements, in cemeteries, at night by the light of a single candle. In the beginning it was mostly poor people, slaves, women, widows, foreigners. It was people who had nothing to gain from it and everything to lose. In the 1st century, in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, Christians were hunted like animals. They were burned as human torches in Nero's gardens. They were fed to lions in the Colosseum. They were crucified upside down, as it is said happened to Peter. They were beheaded, as it is said happened to Paul. They were buried in dark catacombs, and their tombs later became places of pilgrimage. For 3 centuries, being a Christian basically meant being willing to die. And then, in the year 312 after Christ, something changed. Something very big changed. So big, so structural, so decisive that I tell you, with the cold tranquility of someone who has studied the documents for years. The Christianity of before the year 312 and the Christianity of after the year 312 are 2 different religions. Not in name. In name, it remained the same. But in essence, in structure, in functioning, in face, in smell, in language, in spirit, they are 2 distinct things. And what happened in that year and in the following years was the work, mainly, of a single man. This man was Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantine, and his story, the story of how he rose to power, how he defeated his rivals, how he converted to Christianity, how he summoned bishops from all corners of the empire to a city called Nicaea, is one of the most important and most poorly told stories in all of the West. I will tell you this story now, not as it appears in catechisms, not as it appears in school manuals, not as it appears in the hagiographic lives of saints. I will tell you this story as it appears in primary sources, in coins, in inscriptions, in letters, in the accounts of the bishops of the time themselves, who wrote, in Greek and Latin, what they saw with their own eyes. I will tell you this story from Eusebius of Caesarea, who was Constantine's official biographer, who adored him, and yet, even wanting to praise him, left recorded, without realizing it, absolutely disturbing things. I will tell you from Lactantius, another Christian of the time. I will tell you from Zosimus, a pagan historian who lived shortly after, and who had, of course, a different perspective. I will tell you from the very minutes of the councils, from the very imperial laws, from the very coins, which are perhaps the most honest document that survived, because a coin does not lie. A coin shows, in metal, exactly what the emperor wanted the people to see. And what we will discover together over the next few hours is that the official story, the one that says that Constantine saw a cross in the sky, converted to Christianity, granted freedom to Christians, and thus truth triumphed over lies, is at best a childish simplification, and at worst a deliberate falsification. The truth, as almost always happens in history, is more complicated. It is darker. It is more human. And precisely for that reason, it is more interesting. Before anything else, before we reach the year 312, before we reach the famous vision of the cross, before we reach the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, I need to introduce you to the world in which Constantine was born, because if you do not understand his world, you will not understand his choices. And if you do not understand his choices, you will not understand why the Christianity that reached you is in many ways more Roman than Galilean. So let's go back to the 3rd century after Christ. Let's go back to the Roman Empire in decay. Let's go back to a Europe that seemed to be ending. The Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century after Christ was a carcass rotting from within. You need to visualize this. It is not the empire of Hollywood movies. It is not the empire of white marble, white togas, perfect columns, disciplined soldiers marching to the sound of drums. That empire, if it ever existed that way, had died centuries ago. The empire that Constantine found at birth was an exhausted, sick, fragmented place, crossed by crises that overlapped like layers of a wound that does not heal. Economic crisis, military crisis, political crisis, religious crisis, demographic crisis, all at once. A colossus that still seemed great from afar, but that up close trembled in each of its legs. The Roman currency, which had been for centuries the most reliable currency in the known world, had been devalued to the point that it was practically worthless. The denarius, which in the time of Augustus was practically pure silver, now contained less than 5% silver. The rest was copper, bronze, any cheap metal that could be mixed in to make the coin seem to still have value. Merchants in the Mediterranean ports preferred, in many cases, to make direct exchanges, dried fish for olive oil, wool for wheat, slaves for horses, rather than accept the emperor's currency. Prices were rising uncontrollably. In some regions, the price of wheat rose more than 50 times in less than 100 years. Entire families were starving in provinces that had previously exported food to the rest of the world. The armies, which had been Rome's glory, were now its greatest threat. Generals discovered in the 3rd century that it was more profitable to overthrow emperors than to defend borders. Between the year 235 and the year 284, just 49 years, Rome had more than 50 emperors. 50. Do the math. On average, each emperor lasted less than a year on the throne. Most were assassinated by their own soldiers. Others died in battles. Others were poisoned at banquets. Only one, in that entire period, died of natural causes. Only one. The others were all eliminated. This entire period has a name, and historians still use it today: the crisis of the 3rd century. It was one of the most terrible times in Western history. The borders, once impassable, were now as permeable as old sieves. The Goths crossed the Danube. The Franks crossed the Rhine. The Persians in the east captured a living Roman emperor, Emperor Valerian, and used him for years as a footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse. Every time the Persian king mounted his horse, he rested his foot on the back of the Roman emperor. When Valerian finally died, the sources say, they had his body flayed, filled the skin with straw, and displayed the dummy in a Persian temple for centuries. That is how the pride of Rome ended, as a stretched skin in a foreign temple. In this world, in this despair, Constantine was born, probably in the year 272 or 273, in a city called Nisus, in present-day Serbia, the son of a military officer named Constantius Chlorus, who would later become emperor, and of a woman named Helena. I need to talk to you about Helena now because she is important, more important than many historians recognize. Helena was, according to the oldest sources, of humble origin. She was probably the daughter of an innkeeper. She probably worked in the family inn serving travelers, soldiers, merchants, and it was in one of those nights that she met the young officer Constantius. They united. It is unclear whether it was a formal marriage or a concubinage. The documents of the time use ambiguous terms, but whatever it was, Helena was Constantius's companion, and from her, Constantine was born. Years later, when Constantius began to rise in the political hierarchy, he did exactly what many ambitious politicians did, and still do. He discarded the poor wife to marry a woman from a powerful family. Helena was cast aside. She was humiliated. She was separated from her son. And he married a woman named Theodora, who was the stepdaughter of another emperor, and thus would open the doors to the throne for him. Helena lived for years in obscurity, in a kind of social exile, but she nurtured within herself a faith, and Constantine the son was deeply influenced by her. This detail is more important than it seems, because, in the official history, Constantine converted to Christianity because of a supernatural vision on the eve of a battle. But if you look closely, you will see that, long before that vision, there was a mother. There was a woman rejected by her husband for the sake of power. There was a woman who, even humiliated, maintained a faith, and this son, Constantine, grew up knowing of his mother's humiliation and maintaining with her a closeness that lasted a lifetime. It was not a cross in the sky that first planted Christianity within that man. It was perhaps the bitter silence of an abandoned woman who taught her son that there was, somewhere, a God different from the God of emperors. Before continuing, I need to pause with you for a moment, because what I am going to tell you next about how Constantine rose to the throne, about what he did with his rivals, about how he transformed a faith of martyrs into a state religion, is heavy, and I know that at this very moment somewhere in the world, you are alone hearing this, perhaps in the middle of the night, perhaps on a work break, perhaps on a road, driving, perhaps in bed before sleeping. And I want you to know that this meeting between us is not casual. You did not arrive here by chance. The algorithm or fate, or what I would call the necessity of nature, choose the name you prefer, has placed these two men, me and you, in the same silent room at this very moment. And I wanted to ask you something. If these words are touching you, if something here is stirring within you, if an old forgotten question is waking up now, write in the comments a single thing. What have you always wanted to ask about your faith, about your religion, about your God, and never had the courage to ask anyone? It can be just a phrase, it can be just a word, but write it down, because what we put into words begins, finally, to exist outside of us, and what exists outside of us, we can look at. And if you feel it is worth continuing this journey with me to the end, subscribe to the channel. It is not for the sake of numbers, it is not for the sake of algorithms. It is because, on the other side of the screen, there are other seekers like you in other corners of the world, waiting for these stories. Each new subscriber is a candle lit in a dark cave, and we will need many candles to illuminate everything we still have ahead. Now, let's return to Constantine. When Constantius the father finally reached the top of the political hierarchy, the empire was being governed by a new system created by an emperor named Diocletian. This system was called the tetrarchy. The idea was simple. The empire had become too large, too complicated, too threatened to be governed by a single man. So Diocletian divided the empire into four: two main emperors with the title of Augustus, and two subordinate emperors with the title of Caesar, each governing apart, each with their own army, their own court, their own capital. It was supposed to be a solution. It ended up being a factory of civil wars, because at the moment each of those four men had their own army, the temptation to eliminate the other three to take everything would be unbearable, and that is exactly what happened. But before I tell you about the war, I need to tell you something else. Something that happened in the last years of Diocletian. Something that will be absolutely fundamental for you to understand the meaning of the so-called conversion of Constantine. Diocletian was possibly the worst persecutor of Christians in all of Roman history. In the year 303, he initiated what became known as the Great Persecution. It was a systematic, brutal, organized campaign to try to extirpate Christianity from the Roman Empire. Diocletian and his fellow tetrarchs saw Christianity as a threat, not primarily theological, political. Christians refused to offer incense before the images of the emperor, and, in an empire where the emperor was considered almost divine, this refusal amounted to treason. Christians refused to serve in the army in some cases. They refused to participate in public festivities. They constituted within the empire a kind of parallel society, with their own codes, their own leaders, their own mutual aid structures. They were a state within the state. And Diocletian decided to put an end to that. Churches were demolished. Sacred books were burned in public squares. Bishops were imprisoned. Many were tortured. Many were killed in the most horrific ways, burned alive, thrown into wells, beheaded, dismembered, thrown to the beasts. The sources of the time describe scenes of horror that lasted almost 10 years. Blind elders tortured, mothers with babies in their arms thrown into bonfires, entire cities from which not a single Christian was left alive. And in the midst of this persecution, in the midst of this bloodbath, there was a young military officer, tall, robust with light eyes, who served in Diocletian's court as a kind of honorary hostage. He was the son of Constantius, one of the 4 tetrarchs, and was in Diocletian's court as a guarantee of his father's good conduct. This young officer was Constantine. He was just over 20 years old at the time, and he saw, with his own eyes, for almost a decade, the most powerful empire on earth, trying with all its might to crush Christianity, and failing. Constantine saw this, and this observation, cold, military, calculated, from the young officer studying the enemy's movements, will later be decisive, because Constantine will come to a conclusion that none of his fellow tetrarchs managed to reach, a strategic conclusion, a conclusion that will change the course of history. He will conclude the following: if not even 10 years of the worst persecution ever seen could destroy Christianity, then Christianity cannot be destroyed. And, if it cannot be destroyed, then there is only one alternative for a clever ruler. It must be absorbed. It must be co-opted. It must be in some way transformed from enemy of the empire into a pillar of the empire. And that is exactly what he prepared to do. The year 305 brought for the Roman Empire a scene that had no precedent. Diocletian, the emperor who had tried the hardest to destroy Christianity, announced that he would abdicate, voluntarily. Something that practically no Roman emperor before him had done. He decided that he would retire, that he would withdraw to a huge villa he had ordered to be built on the Adriatic coast in present-day Croatia, and that he would spend the rest of his days planting cabbages. Yes, cabbages. When years later some generals came to ask him to return to the throne, he reportedly responded, according to tradition, that if they saw the cabbages he was planting, they would never have the courage to ask such a thing. That was Diocletian. A terrible man, yes. An unrelenting persecutor, yes, but also a man with a certain lucidity that was lacking in almost all the emperors who came after him. When he abdicated, he demanded that his colleague Augustus, Maximian, abdicate as well. And it was done. The 2 Augusti stepped aside. The 2 Caesars, who were below, rose. Constantius Chlorus, father of Constantine, became the Augustus of the West. Galerius became the Augustus of the East, and new Caesars were appointed to fill the vacant positions. This is where things start to get interesting and dirty. Constantine's name was not among the new Caesars, despite being the son of an Augustus, despite being over 30 years old, despite being an experienced officer with a reputation in the legions. Instead of him, 2 men close to Galerius were chosen. It was a clear political maneuver. Galerius wanted to control the succession. He wanted to avoid a hereditary dynasty. He wanted the empire to pass from generation to generation under his influence, and not under the influence of the families of the other tetrarchs. Constantine understood the game. He understood that if he stayed longer at the Eastern court, as a kind of honorary hostage under Galerius's watchful eyes, he would have 2 possibilities. Either he would be poisoned, or he would be sent to a suicidal war on some distant frontier. So he fled. There are several versions of this escape. Pro-Constantine sources tell an almost epic story. He supposedly escaped at night, riding the imperial post horses and cutting the tendons of the animals at each stop so that no one could pursue him. He rode day and night, crossed frozen rivers, descended through the Alps, crossed Gaul. He arrived at the port of Boulogne in present-day northern France, just as his father was boarding for a military campaign in Britain, present-day England. Father and son reunited at that dock. They boarded together. They fought together in the campaign against the Picts in the north of the island. And a few months later, in York, in Britain, on July 25th of the year 306, Constantius died. Sick, exhausted, old. He died in the barracks. And the soldiers, who adored Constantine, did what the Roman armies of the 3rd century had learned to do with ease. They acclaimed the dead man's son as the new Augustus. It was an illegal gesture. Galerius had not approved. The other tetrarchs had not approved. The tetrarchy system did not foresee anything like this. But that was how the empire worked now. Whoever had the army had the power. And Constantine had his father's army. Galerius, upon receiving the news, hesitated. He thought about sending a force to crush the young usurper, but calculated that the civil war would be long, bloody and uncertain. So he offered a middle ground. He recognized Constantine as Caesar, the lower title, instead of Augustus. Constantine accepted. For now. He accepted because he was smart. He accepted because he knew that this lesser title was just the first step. He accepted because he understood that time was on his side. He was in his 30s. He was young. The others were old. He just had to wait. And he waited. In the following years, while governing Gaul, Britain, and part of Hispania, Constantine did some things that, in retrospect, are very revealing. The first. He suspended the persecution of Christians in his territories. He did not formally abolish it. He just stopped enforcing Diocletian's decrees. Christians, under his rule, could rebuild their churches, gather again, and live with some tranquility. This, by itself, earned him immense sympathy in the cities, where the Christian community, despite all the persecutions, remained strong and organized. The second thing, he carefully cultivated his religious image. But be careful, and this is where almost all school textbooks simplify things in a scandalous way. The religious image he cultivated in those early years was not Christian. It was pagan. Specifically, it was the image of a devotee of the god Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus in Latin, was a god that had come from the east, from Syria, and had been officially adopted as a divinity of the empire by a previous emperor, Aurelian, in 274. He was a solar god, unique, supreme, of which all other gods were in some way manifestations. It was in many aspects an almost monotheistic religion, although polytheistic on the surface. Constantine in those years ordered coins to be minted with the image of Sol Invictus on the reverse. He had statues erected. He minted coins where his own face on the obverse appears alongside the inscription Soli Invicto Comiti, to Sol Invictus my companion, on the reverse. These coins were minted in immense quantities. They exist today in museums around the world. And, what is fascinating, he continued to mint these coins for years after his supposed conversion to Christianity. This is one of the most uncomfortable points of the official history. Constantine converted to Christianity, according to tradition, in the year 312, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. But the coins with Sol Invictus continued to be minted until at least the year 321. In other words, for almost a decade after the conversion, the Christian emperor continued to publicly proclaim himself a devotee of the pagan deity Sol. How do these two things reconcile? How can a man who supposedly had a miraculous vision of Christ in the sky continue to publicly declare himself a devotee of a pagan divinity for almost a decade? The honest answer, based on the documents, is that he probably never had, in those years, a religious conversion in the sense that believers today understand that word. He had, rather, a calculated political migration. He realized that Sol Invictus and Christ, in his mind, could coexist for a long time. They were for him manifestations of what he called the supreme divinity, a supreme, vaguely defined divinity that manifested itself in various forms and whose main cult was the responsibility of the emperor. For Christians, he was a Christian. For pagans, he was pagan. For Neoplatonic philosophers, he was a Neoplatonist. For everyone, he was, above all, the emperor. And the supreme divinity, whatever it was at the service of that empire, not the other way around. This is a detail that I want you to reflect on with me for a moment, because it changes everything. The official history, the one still told in Sunday schools, in catechesis, in sermons, in pious television documentaries, tells it this way: Christianity was persecuted. Constantine converted. Constantine gave freedom to Christians. Christianity then triumphed. And from then on, the spiritual truth that had been trampled for centuries could finally shine freely. There is a kind of epic in this narrative, a kind of dramatic redemption, an arc of history in which the good, after much suffering, finally win. It is a comforting narrative. It is a narrative that makes emotional sense. It is a narrative that serves the interests of those who afterward inherited the power of that victory. But it is a false narrative. The true narrative is darker, more ambiguous, more Roman. Christianity did not defeat Rome. Rome absorbed Christianity. Rome did with Christianity what it had done with dozens of other cults from the provinces over centuries. It took the part that served, discarded the part that hindered, gave a new name to what remained, and placed everything within the imperial administrative structure. Christianity, by becoming the official religion, unwittingly inherited the mental structure of Rome, the language of power, the logic of hierarchy, the obsession with uniformity, the intolerance of dissent. All these things that before the Christianity of the catacombs did not have. It was small, plural, decentralized, fragmented into thousands of communities, each with its own interpretation, each with its own leaders, each with its own liturgy. But by becoming the religion of the empire, it had to standardize, it had to centralize, it had to have a single official doctrine, a single official hierarchy, a single official liturgy. And who dictated this unification were not the apostles, who had been dead for almost 300 years. It was the emperor. The emperor summoned the bishops, the emperor presided over the councils, the emperor defined, with his sword behind him, what the correct version of the faith would be. The emperor exiled the defeated bishops. The emperor burned the books of the losers. The emperor, and not Christ, ultimately decided the shape of Christianity that would reach the 21st century. And that is exactly what I want you to understand as we move forward in this narrative. It is not that Christianity is false. It is not that Christ never existed. It is not that people's faith today is empty. What I am saying is more subtle, and therefore more disturbing. What is called Christianity today is a product of two very different forces. On one side, the original message of the man from Galilee, who preached on hills, by lake shores, in small synagogues, in modest homes, and who spoke of the poor, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers. On the other side, the Roman imperial structure, which appropriated that message, translated it into its own language, organized it within its own administrative categories, and transformed it into a power machine that would cover the entire West for a millennium and a half. And when you pray, when you sing a hymn, when you read a passage from the gospel, when you kneel before an altar, when you baptize a child, when you marry in a church, you are, in fact, receiving an inheritance in two layers. The lower, older layer is that of the Christ of Galilee. The upper, more visible layer is that of the Christ of Rome, and almost no one, almost never, is able to distinguish one from the other. I, Spinoza, am here to help you distinguish. Not to destroy, to distinguish, to give you new eyes. And now, with these new eyes, let's return to the year 312. Let's go back to the eve of the most famous battle of our character. Let's return to the night of the supposed vision of the cross in the sky. And let's look calmly, without haste, at what really probably happened that night. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge, October 28th of the year 312, on the northern banks of the Tiber River, a few kilometers north of the city of Rome. Two Roman armies about to face each other. On one side, Constantine, with about 40,000 men, descending from Gaul after a lightning campaign through northern Italy. On the other side, Maxentius, self-proclaimed emperor of Rome, with perhaps 70 or 80,000 men defending the capital. It was a battle that, under any realistic military calculation, Constantine should have lost. It was a battle that, if lost, would have erased his name from the history books. But he did not lose. He won overwhelmingly. Maxentius fled, tried to cross the bridge over the Tiber, fell into the water with the weight of his armor, and drowned. The body was found days later. The head was cut off, impaled on a pole, and paraded through the streets of Rome as a trophy. That victory changed the history of the world. And about what happened in the hours leading up to that battle, one of the most influential narratives of all time was built, the narrative of the vision of the cross. There are two versions of this vision, written by the two main Christian chroniclers of the time, and they are among themselves fascinatingly contradictory. The first version was written by Lactantius, a Christian intellectual who had been the tutor of Constantine's son, and who wrote a work called On the Death of the Persecutors shortly after the events. Lactantius simply says that on the night before the battle, Constantine had a dream. In the dream, he was ordered to mark the heavenly sign of God on his soldiers' shields. Constantine woke up, ordered a sign to be marked on the shields, probably what became known as the Chi Rho, formed by the first two Greek letters of the word Christ, and won the battle. It is a short, sober story with not many details. One night, one dream, one sign on the shields. Victory. The second version, much more famous, more elaborate, was written by Eusebius of Caesarea, the official biographer of Constantine. And the fascinating thing is that Eusebius wrote this version decades after the events. More specifically, after Constantine's death in the year 337 in his work Life of Constantine. In other words, this version was put on paper more than 25 years after the battle, and Eusebius says, in no uncertain terms, that he heard this story from Constantine himself, who swore by his honor that everything was true. According to this version, on the afternoon before the battle, while the sun was setting, Constantine was in front of his soldiers, when suddenly he saw in the sky a cross made of light, placed over the sun with the words, In hoc signo vinces, by this sign you will conquer, in Greek letters. The entire army supposedly saw it. Constantine would have been intrigued, not knowing what it meant. That night, while sleeping, he would have received a second vision, Christ himself, who ordered him to use that sign as a standard in battle. Constantine would then have ordered the famous labarum to be made, a standard with the cross and the monogram of Christ at the top. He marched into battle. He won. Pause with me for a moment. Note the differences between the two versions. Lactantius, writing a few years after the events, speaks of a dream. Eusebius, writing 25 years after the events, speaks of a public vision in the sky, seen by an entire army during the day, with Greek letters in the firmament. See the difference? From an intimate dream to a public manifestation seen by tens of thousands of soldiers. Also note that if that vision had indeed been public, seen by the entire army, it would have been one of the most talked about events in military history. Soldiers would have taken the story home. Families would have told the story to their children. The pagans in the Roman army, in particular, would have been shaken. But outside the restricted circle of Christian chroniclers, practically no one at the time left a record of such a manifestation. The pagan historians of the time speak of the battle. They speak of strategy. They speak of numbers. They do not speak of crosses in the sky. They do not speak of flaming letters. They speak of a very skilled general who won with inferior numbers against a poorly prepared opponent. The most likely explanation, from a historical point of view, is that Constantine, after the victory, realized the political capital he could gain from a miraculous narrative. The soldiers were superstitious. The cities of the empire were superstitious. Every military victory in antiquity had to be explained as a divine manifestation. That was how the Romans thought. When a general won, he said he had been favored by Jupiter, or by Mars, or by Venus. He built temples in thanksgiving. He ordered coins to be minted showing the divinity at his side. Constantine did exactly what any Roman general would have done, with a subtle difference. Instead of attributing the victory to the traditional gods of Rome, he attributed it, in part, to the God of the Christians. And with that, two movements were made at the same time. First, a huge Christian population within the empire, which had been persecuted for a decade, gained an imperial patron. Second, the emperor gained the loyalty of all that Christian population, which began to see him as an instrument of God. It was a brilliant calculation. It was the work of a genius politician. But, and this is the point, it was a calculation. It was a strategic move. It was not a conversion in the spiritual sense. Constantine did not spend the night crying in repentance, abandoning the pagan gods, embracing a new life in Christ. Constantine understood at that moment that Christianity was an inevitable political force and decided to ally himself with it instead of fighting against it. And by allying himself with it, he immediately began to shape it in terms that served his imperial project. The first proof of this is in the so-called Edict of Milan, which was promulgated the following year 313. This edict, in fact, is not exactly a formal edict, but a letter agreed upon between Constantine and his colleague Licinius, who governed the eastern part of the empire. This document established religious freedom throughout the empire. Christians could practice their faith without persecution. Properties confiscated during previous persecutions were to be returned. Churches could be rebuilt. Christians could finally live in peace. And the official history will tell you that this document was an act of love, a manifestation of the emperor's new faith. But note one thing. The edict did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire. It merely legalized it. It allowed Christianity to exist alongside paganism on equal footing. At that moment, Constantine was far from being a Christian emperor in the later sense of the term. He was the emperor of all, pagans and Christians, and he wanted both groups to see him as their protector. The coins continued to bear the image of Sol Invictus. The pagan temples continued to operate. The pagan priests continued to offer incense before the statues of the gods, and Constantine himself continued to call himself Pontifex Maximus, High Priest, of the Roman pagan religion, a title that he retained, it is fascinating to note, throughout his life. Yes, you heard that right. The emperor who is presented as the great convert to Christianity died in 337, still holding the title of High Priest of Paganism. This title, by the way, was passed from him to the subsequent Christian emperors and was only finally abandoned after many decades by an emperor named Gratian at the end of the 4th century. But it was recovered centuries later by another figure, and this is where things get really interesting. The title of Pontifex Maximus, after many centuries, was used again. By whom? By the Bishop of Rome, by the Pope. Today, at this very moment you hear these words, the Pope in Rome holds among his official titles that of Pontifex Maximus, the same title that belonged to the High Priest of Roman paganism, the same title that Constantine used until the last day of his life. This title migrated. From the pagan religion, it crossed through imperial Christianity and reached modern papacy. Almost no one notices this detail. Almost no one asks this question. But the detail is there. In Latin, inscribed on stones, on coins, in official inscriptions, the High Priest of paganism became, after many twists and turns, the High Priest of the Catholic Church. And this migration, which seems like an etymological curiosity, is in fact a symptom of something much deeper. It is a symptom of how, by becoming the religion of the empire, Christianity inherited the structures, the titles, the symbols, the hierarchies of imperial paganism, and how even after the fall of the Roman Empire, these structures, these titles, these symbols, these hierarchies survived within the Church and were passed on. The Catholic Church, in many ways, is the last piece of the Roman Empire that is still standing, and it was Constantine on a battlefield in October of the year 312 who unknowingly planted the seed of this transformation, not because he had a genuine vision of Christ, but because he understood, with the coldness of a general, that the future of the empire was linked to the future of Christianity, and that, if he shaped that future with the hands of an emperor, instead of letting it develop organically, he could control everything. That is exactly what happened. And, 13 years after that battle, the control manifested itself in a way that, to this day, defines the faith of billions of people. This moment of manifestation has a name, it has a date, it has a location, and it has consequences that are still being felt. This moment was the Council of Nicaea, and it is to Nicaea that we will go now. Nicaea, a small city in the province of Bithynia in present-day Turkey, on the eastern shore of a tranquil lake surrounded by gentle hills. Today it is called Iznik. In that year of 325, it was a relatively modest place, but known to the Romans for its well-maintained roads, its mild climate, its proximity to the new capital that Constantine was building across the Bosporus Strait, and which he would shamelessly call by his own name, Constantinople. To this small city, in that spring of 325, converged, coming from all corners of the Roman Empire, a multitude of men dressed in dark tunics, some old, some young, some mutilated, some with scars on their faces, some with eyes blinded by ancient tortures, some with missing limbs because they had been cut off during the persecutions. They were bishops. They were leaders of the Christian communities of the empire. They were men who, 20 years earlier, had been hunted like animals by the Roman authorities, and who now arrived in Nicaea in official carriages of the empire, with expenses paid by the imperial treasury, housed in palaces, fed at banquets, received with honors as state visitors. For many of them, that change was so dizzying that it felt like a dream. One of them, according to reports, upon being received by the emperor, kissed the empty sleeve of another bishop present, because that bishop's arm had been cut off during the persecutions, and Constantine, upon hearing the story, kissed the stump of the amputation himself as a sign of honor. Scenes that deeply moved those men. And among them, walking among them, dressed in a resplendent tunic covered in precious stones, with his hair styled and perfumed, with his eyes attentive to everything, walked the man who had called that meeting, Constantine. To understand what happened in Nicaea, I first need to tell you why it was convened, and to tell you this, I need to introduce you to two characters, two men who, in those years, were engaged in a debate that was splitting Christianity in half. The first was named Arius, the second was named Athanasius. Arius was a presbyter from the city of Alexandria, in Egypt, a middle-aged man, tall, thin, austere, known for his eloquence, for his simple preaching, for his ascetic life. He had developed a way of thinking about Christ that seemed, to many Christians of the time, more coherent, more logical, more faithful to the monotheism inherited from Judaism. Arius taught in essence the following: God the Father is eternal, infinite, unique, without beginning. Christ, the Son, is a creature, the first creature, the most sublime of all, the intermediary between God and the world, but still a creature. There was a time, said Arius, when the Son did not exist. The Father then generated the Son as his first creative act. Christ is divine, yes, but he is divine in a derived, secondary, dependent way. He is not equal to the Father. He is inferior to the Father. To many modern ears this may sound strange. It may sound heretical. But to the ears of the early 4th century, it was a perfectly respectable position, defended by numerous important bishops in all the eastern provinces of the empire. It was, in many places, the majority position. And it had, from a logical point of view, many advantages. It did not challenge monotheism. It did not create the problem of explaining how two beings can be at the same time one single God. It did not require complicated metaphysical constructions. It was simple. It was reasonable. It was communicable. Athanasius, on the other hand, was young. He was just over 25 years old when the council met. He was a deacon in the same city as Arius in Alexandria, but he was a disciple of the bishop of that city, Alexander, who opposed Arius with almost personal violence. Athanasius defended a position that seemed at first glance more difficult to explain. Christ, said Athanasius, is fully God, not a creature, not generated in time, eternally generated, yes, but eternally God, equal to the Father in all things. Of the same substance, homoousios in Greek. This word, homoousios, would be the key word of the council, the word that would divide waters, the word that would decide the fate of Christianity for the next 2,000 years. Why did this matter? Why were adult men, in the midst of the 4th century, willing to kill each other over an apparently abstract difference about the nature of Christ. It mattered because, beneath that philosophical dispute, something profound was at stake. If Christ was a creature, human salvation passed through a creature. God had sent an intermediary creature to save us, but if Christ was fully God, then salvation was, ultimately, the direct work of God himself. It was God himself who had descended and incarnated. It was God himself who had died on the cross. It was God himself who had resurrected. The intensity of the mystery changed completely. Athanasius said, "If Christ is not fully God, then we have not been saved, because a creature cannot save another creature. Only God can save." It was therefore a dispute that touched the heart of the Christian experience, and in theory it was a dispute that should have been resolved by theological arguments, by the study of scriptures, by prayer, by the discernment of the communities. But it was not. The dispute was resolved in another way. It was resolved by the emperor. Constantine, realizing that the dispute was creating factions within Christianity, within his own empire, became alarmed. And here it is important that you understand his mindset. Constantine was not a theologian. Constantine hardly understood Greek, the language in which the debate was being conducted at sophisticated levels. Constantine could barely distinguish one position from another. For him, the dispute between Arius and Athanasius was a dispute between two groups of turbulent men who were threatening the unity of the empire. And unity was for Constantine the supreme value. He had spent his entire life fighting against rivals, eliminating adversaries, unifying territories, and the last thing he wanted was for, after all that, a religious dispute to split again what he had unified at such a cost. So he convened a council, he, the emperor. It was not convened by the bishops. It was not convened by a central religious authority. It was not convened by the voice of the apostles, who had been dead for 300 years. It was convened by the emperor, with official letters, with travel expenses paid, with military escort, with imperial lodging. The bishops were called to Nicaea in May of 325. About 300 attended. The numbers vary in the sources, but later tradition fixed the number at 318, a symbolic number coming from a biblical reference. The fact is that it was a huge council, unprecedented in the history of Christianity until then, and when these bishops arrived, they were led to a large hall. And in the center of that hall, on a throne dressed in gold and purple, sat the emperor. He did not sit as a spectator. He sat as the president of the council. He opened the proceedings. He directed the debates. He chose the witnesses to be heard. He, in the end, formulated the final decision, with the help of some of his theological advisors. Pause here with me for a moment and breathe. Because what I am telling you, although it is in all serious ecclesiastical history manuals, is rarely said this way with this clarity. The Council of Nicaea, which forever fixed the Christian doctrine on the divinity of Christ, which produced the creed recited to this day in millions of churches around the world, was a council led by an emperor who had not even been baptized yet. Constantine would only be baptized on his deathbed 12 years later, and even his baptism, when it occurred, was administered by a bishop who was Arian. Yes, Arian, the emperor who presided over the council that condemned Arianism, was baptized years later by an Arian bishop. The documents confirm this. Serious historians confirm this, but this information rarely reaches Sunday schools, catechisms, sermons, for an obvious reason. Because it complicates the heroic narrative. The heroic narrative says, true Christianity triumphed at Nicaea. The real narrative says a faction with the support of the emperor triumphed at Nicaea, and the defeated were treated as the defeated are always treated in imperial conflicts. They were exiled. Their books were burned. Their names were stained by the official history. The creed approved at Nicaea, which you still pray in many churches today, contains, as its central point, the expression homoousios, Christ of the same substance as the Father. This word was proposed, according to the sources, by Constantine himself during the debate. It is fascinating. A semi-literate emperor in theology proposed the key word that would decide a metaphysical dispute that serious philosophers had been debating for decades. The bishops accepted. Some accepted wholeheartedly, others accepted with reservations, others accepted simply out of fear, because it was obvious what would happen to anyone who dared to contradict the emperor in his own palace. Only 2 bishops, in the end, refused to sign the creed. Only 2 out of more than 300. These 2 were immediately exiled. Their churches were closed, their books were burned. Constantine issued an imperial decree determining that any book by Arius or his followers found anywhere in the empire would be burned in public, and that anyone who hid one of those books would be sentenced to death. Think about that. An imperial decree determining the death penalty for anyone possessing a theology book. We are not talking about a book of black magic. We are not talking about a manual for making poison. We are talking about a theology book, written by a respectable presbyter, read freely for decades in Christian communities in the East. Overnight, possessing that book became a capital crime. Whoever had it and turned it in was spared. Whoever hid it was executed. The copies were, for the most part, destroyed. Today, of Arius's writings, only a few fragments remain, ironically cited by his enemies, because the enemies cited them to refute them. It is like knowing an entire symphony from the footnotes written by critics who hated it. And it is for these and other reasons that I tell you, with all calmness, without any sensationalism, that the story of Christianity, after Constantine, is also the story of everything that was erased, everything that was burned, everything that was banned, everything that was silenced, so that a single version could triumph. There were plural Christianities before Nicaea. There were Gnostic Christianities. There were Arian Christianities. There were Donatist Christianities. There were Ebionite Christianities. There were even Christianities that did not believe that Jesus had died on the cross. There were Gospels circulating beyond the 4 that entered the canon. There was a Gospel attributed to Thomas, one to Mary Magdalene, one to Peter, one to Philip, one to Judas. There were hundreds of texts. Entire communities fed on those texts. Entire families passed those texts down from generation to generation. After Nicaea and the councils that followed, all of this was reduced to a single official version. 4 Gospels, 1 creed, 1 hierarchy, 1 structure, 1 Christianity. And who ultimately decided what that single version would be? The emperor, always the emperor. There is a phrase that circulates in Latin among historians studying the 4th century. It goes like this: Ecclesia in imperio, imperium in ecclesia, the church within the empire within the church. This phrase summarizes, better than many pages, what happened in the decades following Nicaea. The 2 bodies previously separate, the political body of the empire and the religious body of the church, began to merge. Not by a single decree, not in a single moment, but in a slow, continuous process that extended throughout the entire 4th century and ultimately produced what historians call Caesaropapism. The emperor was also the high priest. The high priest was also the minister of the emperor, and the bishops, once pastors of small communities, became public officials with salaries, palaces, slaves, courts, and judicial power over entire populations. To help you understand the magnitude of this transformation, I ask you to join me in a small exercise. Imagine what a bishop was like in the year 250, before Constantine. He was, in most cases, a poor, middle-aged man, chosen by his local community, usually a worker, a craftsman, a small merchant, someone who had a family, who had problems like anyone else, and who was recognized by his Christian neighbors as worthy of shepherding the community. This man gathered people in a house at night by the light of lamps. He read a letter from Paul, or a passage from a gospel, or some psalm. He preached. He distributed bread and wine. He collected offerings for the poor of his own community. He cared for the sick. He visited prisoners. And in the hours when he was not doing this, he returned to his normal work, because no one paid him for being a bishop. He was a volunteer. It was service. It was love. Now imagine a bishop in the year 380, just 5 generations later. This bishop lived in a palace. He had cooks, slaves, secretaries, scribes. He wore elaborate robes. He had a ring on his finger. He had a throne. When he entered the church, everyone prostrated before him. He had legal authority to judge civil cases. He received a salary from the imperial treasury. He had tax immunity. He had military immunity. He did not pay taxes. He did not serve in the army. He had the power to excommunicate, and excommunication had real legal consequences. You could lose property. You could lose rights. You could lose the ability to testify in court. The bishop of the year 380 was in many ways more powerful than the civil governor of his province, and all this power ultimately came from the emperor, who had fused the ecclesiastical hierarchy with the administrative hierarchy of the state. When you compare the bishop of 250 with the bishop of 380, you are not seeing the same position in a more mature phase. You are seeing two completely different positions that happen to inherit the same name. And this is the transformation that Constantine, perhaps without even foreseeing all the consequences, initiated. But at the same time that this was visibly happening on the surface of history, another thing was happening more profoundly within the consciousness of the people. And it is this deeper layer that I want us to spend a moment on. The question that arises is, what exactly was lost when Christianity became an imperial religion? I will try to answer this question as honestly as I can. What was lost, essentially, was the direct, unmediated relationship between each human being and God. Pay close attention to what I am saying. In the Christianity of the catacombs, of small home communities, of the fishermen of Galilee, the relationship with the divine was direct. Each person, even the simplest, could speak to God. They could pray in their own words. They could have visions, dreams, intuitions. They could themselves recognize within themselves the presence of what they called the Spirit. The first Christians read texts, yes, but they read them as a group. They discussed them. Each brought their perspective. The texts were like a sauce around which people sat to drink. There was not yet a rigid hierarchy that dictated who could interpret what and how. When Christianity became an imperial religion, this direct relationship was gradually mediated. A layer was placed between each human being and God. This layer was the hierarchy. To reach God now, you had to go through the priest. To understand the scriptures, you had to go through the bishop. To access the sacred, you had to go through the official liturgy. To receive grace, you had to receive the sacraments. And only ordained priests could administer the sacraments. And only ordained bishops could ordain priests. And only the emperor, at least in the beginning, could confirm bishops. The entire structure became a channel, a single, official, controlled channel through which the divine passed before reaching you. This channel worked. It must be acknowledged. It worked because it was organized, it was predictable, it was stable, it was unified. It allowed Christianity to expand throughout the world with a coherence that few religions have achieved. It allowed monasteries to be founded, universities to be born, cathedrals to be built, entire civilizations to be shaped around a single faith. There are immense merits in the history of the Church, I would not deny that, nor would I want to deny it, but there is also a cost, and the cost was this. By mediating everything, the imperial Church placed the majority of human beings at an ever greater distance from what for early Christian faith was the heart of everything, the direct intimacy with the divine, the ability of each person, within themselves, to hear the voice that spoke to them, the awareness that the kingdom of God, according to the words of Christ himself recorded in the Gospels, is within you. I, Spinoza, dedicated a good part of my life to trying to restore that intimacy. My entire philosophy, in fact, revolves around this. I speak of a God who is the very substance of all that exists, a God of whom each human being is a manifestation, a God who does not need intermediaries because he is already, always, everywhere. When you think, it is God thinking in you. When you love, it is God loving in you. When you exist, it is God existing in you. There is no separation between the Creator and the creature, in the sense that official theology has always sought to impose. There is a single, infinite reality that manifests in infinite ways, and the human being is one of those manifestations. And human liberation, according to me, consists in understanding this, in understanding that you are not separate from the source, but are in some way the source itself manifesting. I know that this philosophy seems strange. I know that it earned me the label of pantheist. I know that it earned me for centuries the accusation of atheism. I know that many people, even today, hear what I say and close their ears, because it seems, at first glance, contrary to everything they have learned. But I ask you now to think about one thing. Who invented the radical separation between God and the world? Who invented the idea that God is a distant Lord up there, on a celestial throne separated from his creation by an abyss? It was not Christ. Christ, reading the Gospels carefully, speaks of an intimate, close, present God who cares for the sparrows and counts the hairs on your head. Christ speaks of a kingdom that is near, within, in the midst. It was not Christ who invented the distant God. The distant God was invented by imperial theology. It was the theology that needed a divine model to justify the political model. If God is a distant celestial emperor, on a golden throne with a hierarchically organized court of angels, then the earthly emperor, distant, on a golden throne with a hierarchically organized court of officials, is his legitimate reflection. Theology mirrors politics, and politics mirrors theology. The two mutually sustain each other. That is why it is so difficult to touch one without touching the other. That is why, for centuries, anyone who dared to propose a different way of thinking about God was considered a political threat, not just a spiritual one. I was considered a political threat in part for this reason. My books were banned, my works were placed on the index. My contemporaries accused me of atheism, immorality, subversion. And yet, I lived a simple life, polishing lenses to support myself, refusing positions, refusing inheritances, refusing anything that could compromise my inner freedom. I was not a threat to the social order. I was a threat to the theology that sustained that order. And that is why they cursed me, that is why they silenced me. But it is also why I am here speaking to you centuries later, because the truth, even when silenced, has the strange habit of surviving those who try to silence it. Returning to Constantine and the 4th century, the fusion between empire and church did not end with Constantine. He merely initiated it. His children continued. The subsequent emperors continued. And the culmination of this process came with an emperor named Theodosius in the year 380. Theodosius issued an edict known as the Edict of Thessalonica, which finally made Nicene Christianity, that is, the Athanasian version, victorious at Nicaea, the official and only religion of the Roman Empire. Before, with Constantine, Christianity was a permitted religion, alongside others. With Theodosius, it became the only permitted religion. Other cults were first marginalized, then prohibited, then persecuted. The wheel turned. The persecuted became the persecutors. The same people, or the same descendants of those people, who had been hunted in the previous century, now hunted those same people who had once hunted them. Pagan temples were closed. They were, in many cases, demolished. In other cases, they were transformed into churches. And even today you can visit, in Rome, in Athens, in Syracuse, churches that were literally built on top of ancient temples, repurposing columns, walls, staircases. The statues of the ancient gods were mostly destroyed, or in the best cases mutilated, with broken noses, severed hands, cracked faces, to neutralize them, according to the belief of the time, from the demonic spirit that still inhabited them. Libraries were burned. The famous Library of Alexandria, with irreplaceable manuscripts from antiquity, was partially destroyed by this wave. Pagan philosophers were silenced. Hypatia, the great Neoplatonic philosopher of Alexandria, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415, dismembered with shards of pottery in the street, and her remains were dragged through the city. All of this, mind you, was done in the name of Christ. In the name of the same Christ who said, "Love your enemies." In the name of the same Christ who said, "Whoever strikes with the sword will perish by the sword." In the name of the same Christ who said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." How was it possible that a faith that began preaching love for enemies came to dismember a philosopher in the street, in broad daylight, in front of a church in just a few centuries? The answer, I think, lies in part in what happened at Nicaea. And before Nicaea, on the night before the Milvian bridge. And before that night, in the mind of a man who understood, with the coldness of a general, that faith was already too strong to be destroyed, and therefore needed to be absorbed, transformed, molded into a tool of the state. Constantine opened a door. And once that door was opened, there was no turning back. I want us to pause now and look at something concrete. Because until now I have spoken a lot about ideas, doctrines, theology, power. But there are material, tangible things that you can still touch with your hand, or see with your eyes, or identify on the calendar, and that are all directly inherited from what happened in the 4th and 5th centuries. And these material things may help you understand, better than any abstract argument, the magnitude of the fusion between Christianity and imperial paganism. Let's start with Christmas, December 25th, the date on which, according to the Western liturgical calendar, the birth of Christ is celebrated. Billions of people at this very moment as I speak to you are organizing around this date parties, gifts, dinners, masses, entire traditions. It is possibly the most celebrated date in the human calendar. But I ask you, and I ask you to answer honestly, do you know why the birth of Christ is celebrated on this day? Most people will answer, because it was the day he was born. But the simple truth, known by any serious historian, is that no one knows on what day Christ was born. The Gospels, which are the only ancient sources about his life, do not provide any date. Matthew and Luke give some details about the location, Bethlehem, about the circumstances, a manger, shepherds in the vicinity, a census from Emperor Augustus, but none at all, gives a date. The first Christians, during the first 2 centuries of their history, did not even celebrate the birth of Christ. They even thought that celebrating births was a pagan thing, something for emperors and tyrants. The early Christians celebrated instead the anniversary of the death of martyrs, which they considered the true birth, the birth into eternal life. But the physical birth of Christ, no one celebrated, no one knew the date, no one cared much. When, then, did December 25th become the official date? The first secure mention of the Christian Christmas on December 25th is in a Roman document called the Chronography of Philocalus from the year 354, that is, more than 30 years after the Council of Nicaea, more than 40 years after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, more than 300 years after the birth of Christ. Before this document, Christian sources fluctuate in dates. Some spoke of January, others of March, others of May. There was no consensus. And what was there before on December 25th? There was the festival of Sol Invictus, that same god I have mentioned several times in this video, the one whose image Constantine stamped on his coins throughout his life. On December 25th in the Roman calendar, the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti was celebrated, the day of the birth of the unconquered sun. It was the date when, from an astronomical point of view, the sun, after the winter solstice on the 21st or 22nd, began to visibly gain strength again. The days, after the solstice, began to grow again. Light began to overcome darkness. The sun was born again symbolically, and this was celebrated with bonfires, parties, gifts, banquets, exchanges of good wishes. When Christianity became the imperial religion, the ecclesiastical authorities found themselves faced with a practical problem. The population of the empire was accustomed to celebrating this festival. It was a popular festival, beloved, deeply rooted in the people's calendar. It was not possible from a pragmatic point of view to simply prohibit it. Trying to take away from the people a beloved festival is a sure recipe for revolt. So they did something else. They did what the Roman Empire always knew how to do better than anyone. They absorbed, they renamed, they covered over. The festival of the birth of Sol Invictus became the festival of the birth of Christ. The bonfires continued, the banquets continued, the exchange of gifts continued, the human warmth around the fireplace in the height of winter continued. Everything continued, exactly the same. Only the theological name of what was being celebrated changed. Instead of Sol Invictus, it was Christ. Instead of the birth of the physical star, it was the birth of the spiritual star. In practice, people hardly noticed the difference. It was the same festival with a different label, This process, in which a pagan festival is repurposed with a Christian name, happened systematically during the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. It happened with Christmas. It happened with Easter, whose dates and rituals inherited elements from both pagan spring festivals and the Jewish Passover simultaneously. It happened with the feast of St. John the Baptist on June 24th, which falls exactly 6 months after Christmas, and coincides with the summer solstice, an ancient solar festival. It happened with the Feast of All Saints on November 1st, which coincides with the ancient Celtic Samhain, the new year of the northern European peoples, the Festival of the Dead. It happened with numerous local festivals where Christian saints were placed over ancient regional deities. People continued to pilgrimage to the same places on the same days, making the same gestures. What changed was the name. Let's continue. Let's talk about Sunday. Why is the holy day of Christianity Sunday? Do you know? The standard answer is, because it was the day Christ resurrected. The Gospels say that he rose on the first day of the week, which in the Jewish calendar was the day after Saturday. And this is true from a textual point of view. But the first Christians, especially those of Jewish origin, celebrated Saturday, maintaining the tradition of the fourth commandment. Sunday, however, continued to be the main holy day. Things changed when Christianity expanded into the Gentile world, into the pagan cities of the empire, and began to have Roman, Greek, Syrian, Egyptian converts who had no Sabbath tradition. For them, Saturday meant nothing. But Sunday, the dies solis, the day of the sun, was an important day in the pagan calendar. It was the day dedicated to Sol Invictus. It was a day already naturally dedicated to worship. And then, on March 7th of the year 321, Constantine issued an imperial edict. This edict determined that, on the venerable day of the sun, all judges, urban inhabitants, and artisans should rest. Rural work was exempted, so that cultivation would not be interrupted. Note the exact words. Edict of Constantine. Venerable day of the sun. Not Resurrection Day, not Lord's Day, not Christ's Day, Day of the Sun. This is the legal document that, for the first time in the Roman Empire, established Sunday as the official day of rest. And it was promulgated by Constantine, in explicitly solar terminology, exactly 4 years before the Council of Nicaea. In other words, even before Christianity had its Trinitarian theology defined, the day of the sun had already been promulgated by the emperor as a day of rest, and this promulgation would later be inherited by Christianity as its own holy day. You sleep in longer on Sundays. You rest on Sundays. Stores in many countries close on Sundays. Masses and services in the vast majority of Christian churches are held on Sundays. And all of this ultimately was instituted by an imperial edict that spoke of the venerable day of the sun. Let's continue. The visual symbols. The crown of rays around the heads of saints, in paintings and icons. Have you noticed it? That luminous aura in the shape of a solar disk, around the heads of Christ, the Virgin, the Apostles, the saints. That image, with that specific shape, does not have Christian origins. It has solar origins. That is how solar gods were represented in Greco-Roman art. That is how Sol Invictus was represented. That is how, on some coins, Constantine himself was represented. When Christian iconography developed in the 4th and 5th centuries, it inherited this motif and applied it to its own saints. The aura of the saints is the aura of Sol Invictus redirected, the mitre of bishops, that pointed tall hat in the shape of a flame that bishops wear in solemn ceremonies. Where does it come from? There is debate among historians, but one of the most accepted hypotheses is that it comes from ritual hats used by ancient Eastern priests, possibly linked to the worship of the god Dagon, or to the priests of Cybele, or to other traditions of the Near East. It does not come from the apostolic tradition. The apostles, according to ancient accounts, walked barefoot in simple tunics, without hats, without rings, without staffs. All this visual paraphernalia came later, was gradually accumulated, partly inherited from the Roman imperial court, partly inherited from other absorbed cults. The crosier, that curved staff that bishops carry, comes from the lituus, the staff of Roman augurs. The augurs were pagan priests who read the future in the flights of birds. Their staff with the top curved became, without most people realizing it, the episcopal crosier. The bishop's ring, a symbol of his power, comes from the rings of Roman magistrates, a symbol of their political power. The white, purple, golden vestments that high clerics wear in ceremonies are direct heirs of the attire of the imperial court. The thurible, with the swinging incense, comes from offerings to pagan gods. The holy water in basins placed at the entrance of churches has almost exact parallels in the purification pools of pagan temples. I could continue this list for hours, but I think the point is made. Most of the visual, symbolic, calendrical, ritual, hierarchical and vocabulary structure of institutional Christianity did not come from Christ. It came from Rome. It came from imperial paganism. It came from the systematic fusion that began with Constantine and was consolidated by his successors. When you enter a European cathedral today, in the 21st century, and look around and see the columns, the arches, the domes, the altars, the thuribles, the crosiers, the mitres, the golden vestments, the liturgical dates, the saints with solar halos, you are seeing, to a large extent, the direct continuity of imperial Rome in a Christianized form. I am not saying that this is necessarily bad. I am saying that this is. It is a fact. It is a verifiable material reality. And, as a philosopher, I believe that the first obligation of anyone who wants to have a serious faith is to look at what they believe with open eyes and ask where each thing came from. Because a faith that cannot withstand this scrutiny is a fragile faith. A faith that falls apart in the face of a historical question is not a mature faith. The mature faith is the one that, knowing all these things, knowing about the fusion, knowing about the appropriation, knowing about the inherited calendar, knowing about the repurposed rituals, can still find within all of this what is genuine, what comes from the heart of the message, what still speaks directly to the soul. Because yes, there is something genuine. I do not deny it. Even within that imperial machine, even under those golden robes, even among those repurposed columns of pagan temples, something of the man from Galilee survived. Throughout all these centuries, it survived in the mystics, it survived in the desert monks, it survived in the small popular saints, ignored by the official hierarchies. It survived in those people, in all centuries, who read the Gospels directly, without mediation, and were moved by the simple and radical words they found there. Blessed are the poor. Sell all that you have and give to the poor. The kingdom of God is within you. These words have never been erased. They are still there today amidst everything. And anyone, anywhere in the world who opens a gospel with clear eyes can find them. The question, therefore, is not to abandon Christianity. The question is to distinguish within it what is Christ and what is Constantine, what is Galilee and what is Rome, what is the original whisper and what is the imperial amplification. This distinction is the first task of any honest believer, and it is also, for other reasons, the first task of any honest non-believer who wants to understand the world in which they live. Because even if you do not believe in anything, you live in a civilization whose mental architecture has been profoundly shaped by this mixture. Your values, your dates, your institutions, your moral assumptions, your fears, your hopes. All of this has passed to some degree through the machine that Constantine helped to build. Understanding this machine is understanding yourself. And now that we have seen the external structure of this machine, it is time to go to what may be deeper, to the internal structure, to the way this fusion between Christianity and empire changed, within people, the way of thinking about God, about evil, about sin, about salvation, about oneself. Because what was inherited from Constantine was not just dates, symbols, and titles. It was an entire way of configuring the human soul. And that is what we will look at now. I will tell you about a word that seems simple, but carries within it centuries of history, And that may be the most important word for understanding the internal transformation of Christianity between the 3rd and 5th centuries. This word is orthodoxy. Orthodoxy in Greek literally means correct opinion. It comes from orthos, correct, and doxa, opinion. It is a term that presupposes a very clear division between what can be thought and what cannot be thought, between the permitted ideas and the prohibited ideas, between the legitimate believers and the illegitimate believers. Before the 4th century, this concept practically did not exist in Christianity. There were divergences, of course. There were debates. There were communities that thought differently from one another. There were even controversies, sometimes harsh, between leaders of communities. But there was not yet, in the full sense, a central authority capable of saying, with the force of law, that this opinion is correct and that one is incorrect. Each community, to a large extent, navigated its own doubts. When Christianity became the imperial religion, this changed, because an empire, by its very nature, does not tolerate a plurality of opinions well. An empire needs uniformity, predictability, control. A general on a battlefield cannot have 5 different religions in his legions, each with a different calendar, each with different dietary prohibitions, each with different loyalties. An imperial administrator governing a province cannot have 10 different interpretations of what virtue is, what marriage is, what justice is. He needs all his subjects to share as much as possible the same mental framework, and that is what the fusion between Christianity and empire produced. It produced a Christianity that, for political necessity, had to uniform itself. It had to have a single orthodoxy. And from this single orthodoxy, it had to automatically produce its opposite, heresy. The word heresy also deserves attention. It comes from the Greek hieresis, which originally meant simply choice. It was a neutral term. Greek philosophers before Christianity spoke of their hieresis without any negative connotation. They were just their choices, their lines of thought, their philosophical schools. But in imperial Christianity, this term received a legal and political connotation. Heretic became someone who made a wrong choice, someone who strayed from orthodoxy. And more importantly, someone who broke with that not only with religious truth but also with the unity of the empire. Because if orthodoxy was the basis of imperial unity, any heresy was automatically an act of political subversion. The heretic was not just someone who was wrong about God. He was someone who threatened the structure of the state. This equation, heresy equals political subversion, will justify, for the next 1600 years, an almost unbelievable amount of violence. Because once you admit this equation, any theological divergence automatically becomes a police matter, and any police matter can be resolved by traditionally police means: imprisonment, exile, torture, death. The first to die for this equation were the Arians after Nicaea. They were exiled, persecuted, in some cases murdered during the 4th century. Then came the Donatists in North Africa, then the Pelagians in Britain and Italy, then the Priscillianists in Hispania, the first Christians to be officially executed by the state for heresy in 385. Yes, in 385. Even before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, even before the Middle Ages began, the same Christians who had been hunted by pagan Romans in the previous century now hunted other Christians with the apparatus of the Christianized Roman state. This logic will become more sophisticated, will institutionalize, will create specialized courts centuries later. The Inquisition will produce technical manuals on how to obtain confessions, on how to identify heresy, on how to grade penalties. It will reach the stake as a public spectacle. It will lead to the burning of women accused of witchcraft. It will lead to the crushing of popular movements. It will lead to the censorship of books. It will lead, centuries after me, to the index of prohibited books, where my own writings were placed. All this repressive machinery, which covered Europe for more than a millennium, has its seed in what was inaugurated at Nicaea. The idea that there is an official orthodoxy, defined by power, and that everything that deviates from it deserves state punishment. Do you see what I am saying? The issue is not just that Constantine favored Christianity. It is not just that he presided over a council. It is not just that he minted pagan and Christian coins at the same time. The issue is deeper. The issue is that he inaugurated a way of thinking about the relationship between faith and power that would become, for 15 centuries, the standard mode of Western civilization. A mode in which what one believes is not a private matter of each conscience, but a public matter of the state. A mode in which religious dissent is a crime. A mode in which the salvation of the soul and obedience to the throne are intertwined. This mode is not natural. It is not universal. It is not inevitable. Other civilizations at other times found other paths. Hinduism, for example, has managed to absorb for millennia an enormous plurality of schools, doctrines, sects, without ever having, within itself, a centralized inquisitorial structure. Buddhism, too. Rabbinic Judaism, after the destruction of the temple, developed a culture of intense debate, in which rabbis vehemently disagreed with each other, but without this disagreement, generally leading to a death sentence. Christianity before Constantine also had this plurality. It was plural. It was debater. It was, in many ways, more like a network of dissenting communities than a unified army. What happened then was a historical choice, not a logical necessity. It was a choice, and this choice was made, in large part, in the imperial palace, by men who needed political uniformity and who used theology as an instrument of that uniformity. Spinoza wrote a book called Theological Political Treatise, published in 1670, anonymously, because I knew that if it were published under my name, I would be imprisoned or worse. This book has, as its central thesis, exactly the inversion of what Constantine established. I argue, in that book, that faith should be separated from the state, that each person's religious conscience is a sacred space, and that no political power has the right to invade it. That the task of the state is to take care of external matters, security, justice, material well-being, and to let internal matters be negotiated in silence between each soul and what it considers sacred. I defended this at a time when this idea seemed, to many, scandalous. I defended this at a time when practically all of Europe still operated under the logic that Constantine had inaugurated. That book of mine was banned. It was placed on the index. It was burned in some cities. But even banned, even burned, it circulated. It was read, hidden in countless places. It was translated. It was cited. It influenced, in ways that are often not even recognized, the thinkers of the Enlightenment, the founders of modern constitutionalism, the architects of religious freedom that, by the end of the 18th century, began to appear in some countries as an official legal principle. The separation of church and state, which today is taken as evident in so many modern constitutions, is to a large extent an heir to this long, silent struggle in which men like me tried to dismantle, piece by piece, the machinery that Constantine had built. And yet the machinery still turns in many places. There are still in the 21st century countries where apostasy is punished by death. There are still countries where books are banned for religious reasons. There are still, around the world, communities that deeply believe that religious dissent is a betrayal that deserves punishment. Constantine's legacy is long. It is tenacious. It will not disappear just because some centuries have changed on the calendar. But, and here is where I want us to pause and think more carefully, Constantine's legacy is not only in the institutions, it is, primarily, within people. It is within what each of us, even without realizing it, has been taught to feel as evident. When a person today, in some neighborhood of any city in the West, feels uncomfortable with a neighbor who has a different faith from theirs, that discomfort is not gratuitous. It is learned. It is inherited. It is the shadow of a structure of 1600 years that taught that faith is an identity trait, a marker of belonging, a boundary between us and them. When a parent expels a child from home who has changed religion, that terrible gesture is not a spontaneous reaction. It is an echo. It is an echo of the Edict of Thessalonica, which said that only one faith was the legitimate faith. It is an echo of Nicaea, which said that only one theology was the correct theology. These echoes live within people, within families, within communities, for centuries. even when the formal institutions that created them have already weakened. That is why I believe that the inner liberation of each of us necessarily involves understanding this legacy, not to feel like victims of it, nor to feel guilty for it, but so that we can calmly choose what we want to keep from it and what we want to leave behind. Most people throughout life receive their faith passively. They are born into a family that believes in such a way. They are baptized before they can consent. They are catechized before they can question. They receive a whole package of beliefs, rituals, values, moral judgments, without having been consulted. A good part of adult life then becomes either a blind defense of that package or an equally blind rejection of it. Few stop to open the package item by item and ask, where did this come from? Do I really want this? Does this make sense to me? This work, this opening of the package, is uncomfortable. It is time-consuming. It is often painful, because upon opening the package you discover that many of the things you thought were evident are not evident. They are contingent. They are historical. They were decisions made by men in certain contexts, with certain interests, and that could have been made differently. You discover that Christmas could have been in another month, that Sunday could have been another day, that Trinitarian theology could have been different, that the ecclesiastical hierarchy could have been different, that the entire configuration of what you call religion is, to a large extent, one configuration among many other possible ones. This discovery shakes you, but after the shake a strange lightness comes, because once you know that what seemed eternal is in fact historical, you begin to be able to choose. You begin to be able to truly have a faith of your own. Not the faith that was imposed on you, the faith that you consciously decided to keep after knowing everything you had to know. And it is at this point, perhaps, that this long historical investigation finds its deepest meaning. It is not primarily about Constantine. It is not primarily about the Roman Empire. It is not primarily about Nicaea. It is, at its core, about you. It is about your ability, sitting there at this very moment as you hear these words, to look at everything you have inherited, and calmly, with clarity, with courage, decide what of this legacy you want to carry forward. The legacy is not good or bad in itself. The legacy is what it is. It has beautiful parts, it has terrible parts, it has cathedrals that take your breath away, and it has bonfires that still shame us. It has sublime music, and it has burned books. It has saints who dedicated their lives to the poor, and it has inquisitors who led innocents to death. All of this is the legacy. And what each generation does with it is ultimately what defines each generation. Ours, yours, the one that is alive now in this confused, lost, anxious, exhausted 21st century, may have, precisely because it is so lost, a chance that other generations did not have. The chance to look at all this with new eyes. The chance not to mechanically repeat ancient gestures. The chance to ask, in silence, within each one, what is truly worth keeping. This question no one can ask for you. Not even I, Spinoza. Not even the algorithm that brought you here. Only you, alone, in the silence of your own room, in the silence of your own heart, can begin to answer it. And perhaps this is exactly the most valuable gift that this long conversation between us can offer you. The question, and the silence, finally, to begin to answer it. Most people, when they hear about the emperor who Christianized Rome, imagine that he must have been a fervent Christian. They picture a man praying on his knees, reading the scriptures, receiving the sacraments regularly. Popular imagination, fueled by centuries of hagiography, paints Constantine almost as a saint in a white tunic, with hands clasped, eyes turned to heaven. The documented reality is completely different. Constantine was only baptized when he was about to die. More specifically, in May of the year 337, on his deathbed, in an imperial villa near Nicomedia, in present-day Turkey. He was around 65 years old. He had ruled the entire empire alone for over a decade. He had presided over the Council of Nicaea. He had financed the construction of basilicas in Rome, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. But throughout all those years, he remained, formally, outside the church. He was not a baptized member. He did not receive communion. He was not subject to ecclesiastical discipline. He was a permanent catechumen, someone preparing for baptism, but indefinitely postponing that final step. Why did he postpone? The most sympathetic hypothesis suggests that he wanted, following a common practice of that time, to be baptized very close to death, so that he could die without any sin to confess. Baptism, in the theology of the time, erased all previous sins. The less sympathetic hypothesis, and I would say more realistic, is that he simply did not want, during his active life, to submit to Christian discipline. As emperor, he had to make decisions that would hardly fit within the Christian moral code. He had to order killings. He had to order torture. Remaining as a catechumen, in eternal preparation, was an elegant way to enjoy the political benefits of association with Christianity without the moral obligations. And there are episodes in this biography that make this hypothesis more convincing. Constantine ordered the execution of his own eldest son, Crispus, in the year 326. Crispus was a successful general, beloved by the troops, the natural successor to the throne. The sources are not entirely clear about the reason. But the fact is that Crispus was executed by his father's order. Shortly after, Constantine also ordered the execution of his own wife, Fausta, under mysterious circumstances. The oldest sources mention that she was suffocated in an excessively hot bath. All this when Constantine was already the Christian emperor, already the man who had presided over Nicaea the previous year. Think about that for a moment. The man who, according to tradition, saw a cross in the sky, ordered his wife to be strangled in a bath. The man who convened the council that defined the divinity of Christ executed his own son based, perhaps, on palace gossip. And yet, this same man is still, today, in some Eastern churches, venerated as a saint. A man with the official title of Apostolos, equal to the apostles. I'm not telling this to demonize him. I'm telling it because it is the real story. And because, without this real story, one cannot understand the type of Christianity he shaped. Constantine was an emperor before being anything else, and emperors do what emperors do. They eliminate rivals, even if they are relatives. They maintain power at any cost. Constantine did all of this, and the Christianity that inherited his name inherited, along with it, these imperial traits. The ability to eliminate dissenters, the ability to manipulate narratives. It was not by chance. It was by spiritual heredity. When, finally, in May of 337, Constantine found himself ill with no hope of recovery, he called a bishop to baptize him. And here comes the detail that few mention. The chosen bishop was Eusebius of Nicomedia. Do not confuse him with Eusebius of Caesarea, the biographer. Eusebius of Nicomedia was another Eusebius, and he was openly, declaredly, without any ambiguity, an Arian bishop. Yes, Arian. From the faction that had been defeated at Nicaea, from the faction whose books Constantine had ordered to be burned 12 years earlier. The emperor who presided over the council that condemned Arianism was baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop. This fact is in the sources, it is in serious ecclesiastical historians, but it is rarely mentioned in popular contexts because it ruins the heroic narrative. It complicates everything. It suggests that Constantine, even at the end, even in the final moments of his consciousness, did not have theological clarity about the issues he himself had ordered the bishops to resolve, or that he had, deep down, sympathy for the Arians, despite having signed the Athanasian version at Nicaea, or that he did not care much, in personal terms, about which side had won. What mattered was that some side had won for there to be unity. Constantine died on May 22nd of 337, on Pentecost Sunday. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, in a special tomb he had ordered to be prepared. Around the tomb, 12 empty sarcophagi, one for each apostle. Constantine had ordered his burial in the center, surrounded by the 12 as the 13th, as if he himself were one of them. This architectural detail says more about Constantine's self-image than any text. He saw himself as equal to the apostles, as the man who, with his sword, achieved what 12 men with their words had not achieved in 3 centuries. Achieved what? Achieved turning faith into structure. Achieved turning the message into an empire. I, Spinoza, read this self-image with sadness. Not because I despise Constantine. I recognize that he was an intelligent man, capable, endowed with a certain greatness. But I read with sadness because I see, in this image of the emperor surrounded by the 12 empty sarcophagi, the perfect symbol of what happened to Christianity. The center was occupied by political power. The apostles were placed around as decoration. The original message became merely the backdrop. The protagonist became the empire. After Constantine's death, the empire was divided among his 3 surviving sons. Constantine II took the western part. Constantius received Italy, Africa, and Illyria. Constantius II, the middle son, inherited the east. The 3 brothers ruled together formally, but within a few years they began to kill each other. In 340, Constantine II was killed. In 350, Constantius was killed in a rebellion. Constantius II was then left alone in command of the entire empire. Constantius II is a crucial figure for understanding the development of Christianity during this period. He was, unlike his father, an enthusiastic amateur theologian. He followed the debates. He took sides. And the side he took was, ironically, the side defeated at Nicaea, the Arian. Constantius II favored, throughout his reign, Arian bishops. He promoted them. He exiled the Athanasians. He tried, in several councils he convened, to reverse the decisions of Nicaea. The result was an extraordinary situation. For almost 30 years after Constantine's death, the official Christianity of the Roman Empire was, to a large extent, Arian. That same doctrine that had been condemned as heresy in 325 returned to power. Athanasian bishops were exiled en masse. Athanasius, the very defender of Nicene faith, spent most of his adult life in exile. He was exiled 5 times. He spent years hiding in the Egyptian desert, sheltered by monks. At times it seemed that Arianism would triumph definitively. This detail is essential for you to understand one thing. The Christian doctrine was not built in a linear progression, where the revealed truth manifested itself with increasing clarity. It was built in a prolonged political struggle, where different factions, with different imperial support, at different times, alternated in power. Today, Athanasius is a saint and Arius is a heretic. But for many years, from the perspective of those living at that time, the future was completely uncertain. It could have gone in any direction. If Constantius II had lived longer, if the emperors who came after him had been different, if the military and political decisions had been different, the Christianity that reached you could be Arian. You could be praying today to a Christ who is the greatest creature, but not God. I do not tell you this to destroy your faith. I tell you this to say one simple thing. Mature faith is the one that knows that its historical formulation is fragile, was chosen, could have been different, and yet is capable of finding within this contingent formulation a genuine experience of the divine. Childish faith is the one that believes that its formulation fell ready from heaven, without any human intervention. But let us return to Constantius II. When he died in 361, he was succeeded by a cousin named Julian. And the story of Julian is one of the most fascinating of the 4th century. Julian was a nephew of Constantine. He had seen, as a child, his father and brothers being assassinated in a dynastic purge organized by Constantius II in the early years of his reign. Only Julian and his brother remained, both children, both spared for being considered too small to threaten the throne. Julian grew up as a kind of golden prisoner. He was educated by Christian tutors. He was forced to follow the rites of the official faith, but secretly, he hated that faith. He hated it for personal reasons. After all his murdered relatives had been killed by other Christians in the name of Christian imperial politics. And he hated it for intellectual reasons. The more he read pagan philosophers, especially the Neoplatonists, the more he felt that the Greek philosophical tradition was deeper, more subtle, more beautiful than the simplified theology that was being imposed on him. When Julian ascended to the throne in 361, he did something no one expected. He tried to reverse the Christianization. He reopened pagan temples. He restored the ancient cults. He removed the tax privileges of bishops. He attempted to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, yes, the Jewish temple, destroyed by the Romans almost 300 years earlier, as a gesture of hostility towards Christians. The works began. There were, according to the sources, earthquakes and mysterious fires that disrupted the excavations. The works were interrupted. Christians called him, and still today in some texts, call him Julian the Apostate, the emperor who abandoned the faith. Julian ruled for only 18 months. He died in June of 363 during a military campaign against the Persians. He was struck by a spear in the belly. Some pagan sources suggested that the spear was thrown by a Christian soldier from his own Roman army. There is no way to confirm. But the story of this rumor, in itself, is already revealing. It shows the intensity of the conflict of the time. With Julian's death, the attempt to reverse the course of events ended. The emperors who came after him were Christians again. And in 380, Theodosius promulgated the Edict of Thessalonica. Nicene Christianity became the only official religion of the empire. Other cults were gradually banned. Temples were closed. Pagan sacrifices were prohibited under penalty of death. I want you to note one important thing. Between the Edict of Milan in 313, which merely tolerated Christianity, and the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, which made it exclusive, 67 years passed, just 2/3 of a human life. In 67 years, Christianity went from a persecuted religion to a persecuting religion, from a threatened minority to an oppressive majority. This speed is dizzying. This speed means that the transformation was not organic, it was not natural, it was engineering, political engineering, conducted from above, deliberately, by emperors who saw faith as an instrument of imperial unification. And when something is built so quickly, with so much intervention from power, with so much instrumental use, that something carries marks. It carries the mark of haste, it carries the mark of imposition. And these marks remain alive in the final product even centuries later. You today, when sitting in a church pew, looking at an altar, reciting a creed, listening to a homily, are in direct contact with that 4th century engineering. It is not theory. It is material and mental heritage. A figure who perhaps is, of all, the one who most consolidated what Constantine had inaugurated. Her name is Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, bishop, theologian, philosopher, writer of a literary force that few in the West could match, and at the same time, the man who most clearly formulated the theological justification for the religious violence that would mark Europe for the next 1200 years. Augustine was born in 354 in the small town of Tagaste in the African province, present-day Algeria. His mother, Monica, was a fervent Christian. His father, Patricius, was pagan. Augustine grew up in a divided home, and he himself spent decades oscillating. He was a Manichaean during his youth. He was skeptical. He was Neoplatonic. He only definitively converted to Christianity at 32 in Milan under the influence of Bishop Ambrose. He returned to Africa. He became a priest, then a bishop. And in this condition, he wrote an immense work that still largely underpins Western theology. Augustine's merits are real. The Confessions are one of the first great autobiographical texts in world literature. The City of God is a profound reflection on the place of faith in history. I, Spinoza, although I deeply disagree with Augustine on almost everything, recognize his stature. He is a worthy interlocutor, even when he seems mistaken to me. But there is one aspect of Augustine's work that deserves special critical attention. This aspect is his justification for the use of state force in matters of faith. Augustine had, for much of his life, had to deal with a dissident movement called Donatism. The Donatists were Christians from North Africa who had separated from the official church in a conflict over the validity of the sacraments administered by bishops who, during the persecution of Diocletian, had handed over the sacred books to pagan authorities. The divergence was originally technical, but it turned into a schism. For decades, the church in Africa was divided into two, the official one linked to Rome and the Donatist one popular in rural areas. Augustine began his pastoral life advocating dialogue with the Donatists. He wrote letters, he tried to convince them by word. But as the years passed and the schism persisted, Augustine changed his position. He began to advocate, increasingly emphatically, the use of state force against the Donatists. He supported imperial laws that confiscated Donatist properties, expelled Donatist bishops, and imprisoned Donatist preachers. And he developed a theological argument that would have terrible consequences for over a millennium. Augustine's argument starts from a phrase in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 14, where the owner of a feast, seeing that the guests were not coming, sends his servants to the roads and says, "Compel intrare," force them to enter. This parable, read in its original context, is clearly a metaphor about the urgency of accepting God's invitation. It is not, in any literal sense, a permission to use physical force against religious dissenters, but Augustine made exactly this reading. He argued that, just as a loving father may use force to prevent a child from drinking poison, the Mother Church may use the force of the state to prevent its wayward children from perishing in heresy. Force, in this logic, is a form of love. Coercion is pedagogical. Violence, when done by the Church supported by the state, is not violence, it is charity. This argument, written by Augustine during the early decades of the 5th century, will be the theological basis for practically all religious persecution of the Christian West until the 18th century. It will be cited to justify the Albigensian Crusades in southern France in the 13th century. It will be cited to justify the Inquisition. It will be cited to justify witch hunts. It will be cited to justify the forced colonization of the Americas with armed conversion. It will be cited, too, to justify the persecution of Jews at various moments in European history. Always the same argument. Forcing people to enter is love, not violence. I, Spinoza, cannot read this argument without feeling, even today, centuries later, a cold indignation, because it is exactly this argument that sustained the curse that was cast upon me in the Amsterdam synagogue. It is exactly this argument that sustains the persecution of my books. Augustine's compel intrare has crossed the centuries like a poison that has seeped into every layer of Western civilization. And the most disturbing thing is that Augustine himself was a man of rare intelligence, of real spiritual sensitivity. His confessions reveal a man who intimately knew his own weaknesses. He had the intellectual instrument to perceive how much his justification of coercion was, at its core, a betrayal of the very Christian message, but he did not realize it, or he realized and still maintained the argument because the immediate pastoral interests seemed more urgent to him. This, perhaps, is one of the most tragic aspects of the history of Christianity. It is not that it was built by evil men. It was built to a large extent by good men who, at crucial moments, made wrong, or compromising, or blind choices. And these choices accumulated until they produced a machine that no one individually would have desired, but that collectively everyone fed. There is within Christianity another tradition, a tradition that has always rejected the compelle intrare, a tradition that insisted in minority, persecuted, marginalized voices, that faith to be faith must be free, that coercion produces hypocrites, not converts, that what is believed out of fear is not faith, it is simulation. This tradition has been present in some fathers of the ancient church. It has been present in medieval popular movements. It has been present in some radical reformers of the 16th century, especially the Anabaptists, who paid with their own lives for their defense of religious freedom. This countercurrent is what we need to rescue and amplify now, because it represents, within the very Christian history, the natural antibody against Augustine's poison. Free faith is possible, not as an exception but as a norm. But for it to flourish, it is first necessary to recognize how strong, ancient, and rooted the opposing tradition is. And it is necessary to consciously decide, in each generation, in each life, which of the two threads we will inherit. Now let's go to an aspect that is rarely discussed publicly, but that may be the most decisive of all. I will tell you about what happened to the figure of Christ himself within this imperial machine. The Christ of the Gospels, read simply, is a disconcerting figure. He walks barefoot or with worn sandals. He has nowhere to lay his head. He eats with prostitutes and tax collectors. He touches lepers. He refuses honorific titles. He washes the feet of the disciples. He says he came to serve, not to be served. He says the last will be first. He says it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. He says, at the time of his arrest, that whoever strikes with the sword will die by the sword. He dies on a cross, abandoned by most of his followers, executed as a common criminal. This Christ is radical. This Christ is uncomfortable. This Christ, taken seriously, is incompatible with any imperial structure. When Christianity became an imperial religion, this Christ needed to be in a way reconfigured. Not erased, erasing him entirely would be impossible because the Gospels continued to be read, but reframed, covered, buried in part, under another image. The image that came to the forefront, in art, in liturgy, in official preaching, was that of Christ Pantocrator, the all-powerful Christ, the enthroned Christ, dressed in imperial robes, with severe eyes, holding a closed book, blessing humanity with a sovereign gesture. This Christ appears in the domes of Byzantine churches, in the mosaics of basilicas. This Christ is a celestial emperor. He has angels beside him dressed as court officials. Note the inversion. The Christ of the Gospels is always below. He is with the lowly. He is on the margins. The Christ Pantocrator is always above. He is above all. He is at the center. The fundamental spiritual direction has inverted. Before God descended, after God reigned, before the sacred was in the manger, in the leper, on the cross, after the sacred was on the throne, in the dome, in splendor. This inversion is theological, yes, but it is primarily political, because the Christ Pantocrator is the divine version of the Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor, by associating himself with the image of Christ Pantocrator, gains supernatural legitimacy. Christian emperors became exclusively vicars of the one true God. The emperor is the earthly reflection of the celestial Pantocrator. The court of the imperial palace reflects the court of the celestial palace. The administrative hierarchy reflects the angelic hierarchy. Everything fits into a single order, vertical, descending, in which each being has its place fixed by a will that cannot be questioned. This cosmological model will structure the European mentality for over 1,000 years. It will justify absolute monarchy, in which the king is vicar of God. It will justify the feudal structure, in which everyone is born on their step, and must remain there by divine design. It will subsequently justify colonization. All this mental architecture, with all its oppression, ultimately depends on the image of Christ Pantocrator. Without this image, the edifice falls. I, Spinoza, propose in my thought another image of God, an image in which God is not a sovereign sitting on a celestial throne, but the unique substance of reality, present in everything, manifesting in everything. For me, God does not govern the universe from the outside. God is the universe, in its deepest dimension. Each human being is, in itself, a finite manifestation of the infinite. This God has no court, has no palace, has no angelic hierarchy, has no throne. And precisely for this reason, this God cannot be used to justify any earthly political hierarchy. Perhaps that is why I have been so hated. Not because I am blasphemous in the traditional sense, but because my philosophy is, in its structure, anti-imperial. A philosophy in which each of us is a direct manifestation of the divine is a philosophy that takes away from the emperor, and from the pope, and from the king, and from any intermediary figure their role. There is no longer a need for mediation. There is no longer a hierarchy between you and the sacred, and a political and ecclesiastical structure based on mediation cannot tolerate this idea. But you are here, and I am speaking to you. And this conversation in itself is a small victory against all those who for 4 centuries tried to prevent me from being read. The Christ Pantocrator dominated the Christian imagination for over a millennium, but in history there has always been, in parallel, a subterranean resistance. There have always been groups, individuals, movements that tried to rescue the Christ of the Gospels from beneath the Pantocrator. The monks of the Egyptian desert in the 4th and 5th centuries fled civilization precisely because they saw that imperial Christianity was losing touch with the original message. The Franciscans, in the 13th century, made a similar movement, voluntarily embracing extreme poverty as a protest against the luxury of institutional clergy. The Rhineland mystics, like Meister Eckhart in the 14th century, advocated for an inner, direct spirituality, without mediations, and were condemned by the Church for it. The Anabaptists in the 16th century advocated for Christian communities of equals, without hierarchy, without violence, and were massacred. Every time someone within Christianity tried to return to the Christ of the Gospels from beneath the Pantocrator, they were treated as a threat. The moderation of Christianity, to a large extent, is the name of the continuation of the imperial project, and the radicality of Christianity, to a large extent, is the name of the return to the original message. Think about your own religious experience, if you have one. How many times has the message that reached you been that of the radical Christ of the Gospels? How many times has it been that of the Christ Pantocrator or its more discreet variants? You will probably discover, by doing this accounting, that most of what you received as Christianity is in fact a legacy of the imperial configuration, and that the truly Christian part, in the evangelical sense, is a smaller, harder-to-find current. This discovery, when made seriously, is disconcerting, but it is also liberating, because it allows you from now on to distinguish within everything you have received what comes from Christ and what comes from Constantine, and it allows you to choose, with more awareness, which of the two threads you want to continue walking. This choice is yours. It always has been, and it always will be. But it only becomes real when you truly know what you are choosing. At this point in our conversation, I imagine that a question is forming within you, a question that you may not have fully articulated yet, but that is pressing, wanting to emerge. The question is something like this: if all of this is true, then what remains? What in all of this is genuine? What is worth keeping? I think this question is the most important of all, and I want to answer it carefully. The first thing to say is that, even within the imperial machine, even under all the layers of power and co-optation, something real has survived, and still survives. The texts of the Gospels, despite having been selected, copied, translated and retranslated, still largely preserve the original voice. When you read, today, in any language, the Beatitudes, you are reading words that, most likely, were actually spoken, with slight variations, by a man who lived in Galilee 2,000 years ago. When you read the parable of the prodigal son, or that of the Good Samaritan, or the Sermon on the Mount, you are in direct contact with a voice that has crossed all institutional filters and still reaches you alive. That voice alone is more powerful than the entire structure that tried to appropriate it. It is perhaps the greatest miracle of the religious history of the West, not the supernatural miracles that later sources accumulated, but the simple miracle that a human voice, spoken 2 millennia ago on small, dusty roads, can still touch the hearts of people in the 21st century. The second thing to say is that within the Christian tradition itself, at all times, there have been men and women who lived, with seriousness and depth, what they preached. Not all were committed to the imperial game. There were hermits who withdrew to caves and lived there for decades in prayer. There were nuns who dedicated their entire lives to caring for the sick. There were priests who were simply good men present in their communities close to the poor. There were theologians who thought deeply about the mysteries of existence. There were mystics who had spiritual experiences that enriched for centuries the religious sensitivity of all humanity. All of this is part of the Christian heritage. All of this is genuine. The third thing to say, and this is perhaps the most important, is that what makes a faith genuine is not primarily its institutional history. It is its living experience in the present. A faith may have, in its past, all the contradictions, all the co-optations one can find, and yet at the moment when a concrete person now with a specific heart, in a specific place, finds within that tradition a point of contact with something that transcends them, at that instant, in that experience, there is something real. Spiritual life is not a matter of historical purity. It is a matter of existential depth. I, Spinoza, did not convert to Christianity. I remained, until the end, someone with a distant relationship with any institutional religion. But I recognize calmly that many deep, serious, intelligent people have lived within these traditions and found nourishment for the spirit in them. The question for me has never been to reject religion wholesale. The question has been to think clearly about religion, to distinguish what serves life from what serves power, and, from that distinction, to make conscious choices. When I say that God is nature, I'm not saying that God is a rock or a tree. I'm saying something more subtle. I'm saying that what we call God and what we call nature are ultimately two names for the same infinite reality, of which everything that exists is an expression. When you look at a starry sky, you are in some way looking at God itself. When you look at a laughing child, you are looking at God itself. When you look at yourself in the mirror, honestly, you are looking at a finite manifestation of the infinite divine substance. This vision is liberating because it eliminates the distance between you and the sacred. You do not need to ask, plead, go through rites, buy indulgences, obey hierarchies. You are already within the sacred. You always have been. This attitude is what I would call philosophical faith. It is not the faith of catechesis. It is not the faith of dogma. It is a deeper, quieter, more personal faith. A faith that asks only that you open your eyes to the reality that is right in front of you, and that you recognize, in that reality, something infinitely greater than you can imagine. This faith has no church. It has no hierarchy. It has no creed. But paradoxically, it can coexist with any church, any hierarchy, any creed. You can perfectly attend a Catholic church, or a Protestant one, or a synagogue, or a mosque, and at the same time live within yourself this philosophical faith. The two things are not contradictory. The first is the shell. The second is the core. The deepest people I have known, in any tradition, were people who had within themselves this philosophical faith and used the religious tradition only as language, as rhythm, as community. Returning then to the initial question, what remains after all we have discussed? A lot remains. The voice of the Gospels remains in its radical simplicity. The communion of real people who at all times lived seriously what they believed remains. The possibility, always open, for each one to seek in the silence of their own heart, a direct contact with the infinite remains. The aesthetic beauty accumulated over centuries remains. In short, everything that continues to be able to touch today, a human heart that approaches with open eyes remains. What does not remain is the imperial structure, the pretense that a single institution holds the monopoly on the sacred, the justification for violence in the name of faith, the subordination of individual conscience to hierarchical authority, the fear deliberately cultivated as an instrument of control. These things can be left behind without any real loss. On the contrary, leaving them behind is, to a large extent, to return closer to the Christ of the Gospels. This is the paradox. To rediscover Christ, it may be necessary to abandon Constantine. To rediscover faith, it may be necessary to leave the imperial church, and this rediscovery is a journey that each one must take alone, at their own pace. I, Spinoza, am just trying, with you, to open a door, not to pass through it. The door opens to a path, and the path from here is yours. I will not bring more historical information. I will try to leave you with some final reflections, some seeds that may continue to work within you long after this video ends. The first reflection is about time. Together, we have traversed over 1,700 years of history. We started in the 3rd century, passed through the 4th, peaked into the 5th, briefly mentioned the 13th, the 16th, my own 17th century, and arrived at yours, the 21st. When you look at something from afar in time, that something loses its aura of naturalness. What seemed evident reveals itself as constructed. What seemed eternal reveals itself as contingent. This perception is a tool of liberation, because it places in your hands the power to question, to evaluate, to choose. What is historical can be changed. The second reflection is about the place of the individual. The entire history of institutional Christianity has, to a large extent, been the story of the effort to subordinate the individual to the religious collective. But subordination comes at a price. When the individual is completely subordinated to the collective, what is ultimately the source of any real spiritual experience is lost. Spiritual experience, to be real, needs to be personal. No one prays for you, no one believes for you, no one loves for you. These things, in the end, can only happen in the irreplaceable silence of each singular conscience. Relearning to inhabit this solitary place without fear, without haste, without guilt, is perhaps the most important spiritual task of each life. The third reflection is about the humility of thought. Many people, upon discovering how historically constructed their religious tradition is, swing from one naive certainty to another. Before, they thought they knew everything. Afterwards, they think they know everything, but in the opposite sense. Before, they were naive believers. Later, they became militant atheists. This pendulum is understandable, but I think it is a mistake, because it exchanges one form of closure for another. Maturity is somewhere different. In a position where one recognizes with humility that neither total faith nor total disbelief does justice to the mystery of existence. There is in the universe more than fits in our theologies, but there is also more than fits in our denials. The wise person is the one who learns to live in the open space between the two certainties. The fourth reflection is about compassion. I recognize that this entire conversation may have at times a critical tone, perhaps even severe. I have criticized emperors, bishops, doctrines, institutions. But, deep down, the only just attitude towards all of this is compassion. Compassion for the emperors, who inherited empires in crisis. Compassion for the bishops, who often sincerely believed they were serving God, even when they were unwittingly serving power. Compassion for simple believers, who received a ready-made faith and lived it with all the seriousness they could muster. Compassion for the executed heretics, for the martyrs on both sides, for the anonymous victims of centuries of religious violence, and compassion for ourselves who inherited such a complex history, so filled with light and shadow. The fifth and final reflection is about love. Everything we have discussed, at its core, revolves around a single question. Christianity, at its evangelical core, is a religion of love. Christ said that the greatest commandment is to love God and your neighbor as yourself. He said that without this love, all other virtues are worthless. The question, then, that each of us needs to ask about any religious structure, any doctrine, any institution, is simple. Does this structure, this doctrine, this institution produce in real life more love or less love? Does it bring people closer together or push them apart? Does it generate comfort or fear? Does it welcome or exclude? Does it liberate or imprison? Where the answer is more love, there is something of the Christ of the Gospels, even if covered by 1,000 layers of other things. Where the answer is less love, there is something else entirely, perhaps the residue of the imperial project, perhaps human fear disguised as doctrine, perhaps power masquerading as sacred. But it is not Christ, it is not the Christ of the hills of Galilee. It is not the Christ who said, "Love one another." This criterion is simple, it is radically simple, but I think it is the only one that truly works. It is not a theologian, it is not a bishop, it is not a council. It is a question that anyone can ask, at any moment about any religious practice. Spinoza, lens polisher, excommunicated Jew from Amsterdam, author of forbidden treatises, conclude here my part of our conversation. I was not paid to tell you this. I have no institution to defend. I am not trying to convert you to anything. I am simply trying, with the greatest honesty I can muster, to offer you some mental tools so that you can walk from here with your eyes a little more open. The great lesson of Constantine, in the end, may be this. Power, any power, always wants to co-opt the sacred. It always wants to turn faith into an instrument. That was Constantine's work, and it was, to a large extent, successful. But within every human being, there exists a point that no emperor, no bishop, no institution can ever occupy. That point is your conscience. It is your inner silence. It is the place where you, alone, decide what to believe, what to love, what to refuse. That point is inviolable. It remains there, intact, waiting for you to recognize it, for you to reoccupy it, for you to reclaim it. Reoccupying that point is perhaps the most radical, oldest and newest way to be free. And from it, calmly, carefully, patiently, you can finally choose how you want to live, what you want to believe, what you want to love. Spinoza's lesson in this video ends here. Yours within you is just beginning. May the silence now do its work. May the question remain alive. May love whenever possible prevail. Goodbye, friend, or better, until always.